In this video blog, General McDaniel and I discussed the ongoing Russia invasion of Ukraine and allegations of war crimes committed by Russian forces. It seems like wartime atrocities in Ukraine are identified or being identified on a weekly basis. In well-publicized statements, President Biden famously characterized Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, as a war criminal. And here we're going to talk about how international law views war crimes. International law provides rules for how countries may go about using force during armed conflict. And this body of law is oftentimes referred to as the law of war or international humanitarian law. And under this body of law, both countries can be found to have violated international law, and individuals, political leaders, military leaders, can be found criminally responsible. The most important sources of law here when it comes to war are the Geneva Conventions that were agreed to following World War II. And among the most important rules built into that legal framework is concern for civilian populations and wanting to make sure that civilians are protected from the ravages of war. And so, General McDaniel, maybe you could start off by talking about how the law of war goes about protecting civilian populations.
Thanks. I'd be happy to do so. So, Professor Finnegan, as you know, these principles predate the Geneva Convention by thousands of years. One of my favorite quotes was by the first Caliph Abu Bakr, back in the sands of history, who said that the blood of women, children, and the old shall not stain your victory, and sort of telling his warriors at such an early time in history that you have to have a legitimate victory. And in the United States, this really took hold I think with the Lieber Code, right before the Civil War, when a Prussian Franz Lieber came over and wrote sort of the first code for U.S. Union soldiers in the Civil War, which led to the first Geneva Convention in 1864. And one of the things he authored was this principle of military necessity. And when you look at these principles, starting with military necessity, you say to yourself, okay, maybe this isn't an oxymoron. There's a reason that we have these principles and have to follow them. So military necessity is the idea that you can only use the amount of force. You can use overwhelming force, and you can use it very quickly because you want to assure the submission of your enemy as quickly, and if I can use the word, as cleanly as possible. But it has to be force which is recognized by law, and it's only the force necessary to overcome your enemy. And the focus is then on the enemy. And by doing so, we're saying you can't focus on civilians, as has been said since Abu Bakr. So military necessity, and is coupled with two other principles. The next one we call humanity. And it's the idea that you have to avoid unnecessary suffering. And when we're talking about avoiding unnecessary suffering, we're talking about the enemy forces. So it's intertwined with this idea of military necessity. And the focus is on the enemy soldiers, the wounded, those who become prisoners of war, that they shall not be touched once they have that status. And that, as Professor Finnegan said, gave rise to the first Geneva Conventions, the first two Geneva Conventions, for soldiers and for sailors. And then the third principle is the one of distinction, that you have to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants, which again, you can see how that intertwines with the other two. And distinction, therefore, it's limited to the battlefield. Even in this day and age where we have asymmetric warfare and it's difficult to determine what the battlefield is and who the combatants are, you still have to use these three principles, including distinction. And so that goes to this idea of sparing the civilians and gets right to the heart of our discussion today on the Russian invasion of Ukraine almost 2 months ago now.
Yeah, I agree. In my view, within the law of war, arguably the most important principle is this principle of distinction. The notion that militaries must distinguish between civilians and combatants, and that attacks cannot be directed against civilians. Civilians are not lawful targets. And we've seen over the past few weeks, since the launch of the Russian invasion, allegations that the Russian military has violated this principle of distinction. Maybe you can offer a few thoughts on that.
Yes, I absolutely. I mean, one of the things I think stunned the world was twofold. First, it was how quickly the Russian invasion was bogged down, literally in this mud in Ukraine, as well as figuratively through the loss of logistics. They didn't have the fuel. And the second point after it gets bogged down is how quickly they resorted to tactics where they are targeting civilians. Now, I say targeting civilians because, as we'll talk, there's evidence of that. But really, remember the idea, as Professor Finnegan and I just said, about distinction and unnecessary suffering. You can't have indiscriminate shelling. You can't just have we saw both cruise missiles targeting civilian facilities, including schools and hospitals, famously a maternity hospital in one case. And then we have dumb bombs that are just being dropped, as used to be done carpet bombing in World War II, giving rise to the emphasis on some of these principles. So very quickly we see, within a week or so, we have reports of Russian troops that are targeting or else indiscriminately shelling and using artillery and missiles against civilian populations. And whether you're targeting an individual civilian or you're targeting a civilian population, they are both war crimes, although different in scope and in the focus that we give them under the international humanitarian law.
Right, and I think that there is evidence on the ground of indiscriminate attacks. That is, bombardment without consideration of whether civilians or civilian assets like apartment buildings or what have you might be harmed. There is a notable exception to this idea that civilians cannot be targeted, and that's civilians who who take up arms and directly participate in hostilities. And one interesting thing that has struck me about developments in Ukraine is that there are ordinary Ukrainian citizens, accountants, doctors, software experts, who have taken up arms and taken positions in and around, for example, Kyiv. In those situations, because of that conduct, those civilians lose their status as non-combatants. But I guess that's somewhat beside the point, given what we've seen in terms of the Russian approach to indiscriminate attacks.
That's a great point that I hadn't thought of, Professor Finnegan. So for civilians to become combatants and to become lawful combatants is a really interesting focus under international humanitarian law. And basically, you have to have three things. You have to have an organized force. They can't just be out there. It's just a crime if you're out there sniping. Even though you might have the best of purposes, best of intents. So you have to be part of an organized force and under command and control. You have to have some sort of badge of distinction, even if it's just using a blue and yellow flag. A patch upon your clothing will be sufficient. And then, of course, you have to have a focus on the enemy forces as opposed to just targeting other civilians, as we sometimes see when conflicts devolve into just a mass riot sort of circumstance. So in those cases, then those civilians become lawful combatants and are therefore protected as prisoners of war under the Geneva Conventions.
One final thought that I had about our discussion here of the law of war and the protection of civilians is a term that you sometimes see discussed in the media, this concept of collateral damage. That is not purposely targeting civilians or civilian assets, but unintentional or incidental civilian casualties that result from military activities. Maybe you could comment briefly on that aspect of the law of war.
Sure. And after that, I'll throw it back to you to sort of wrap us up for this segment. So collateral damage is kind of an ugly euphemism, isn't it? Because we're really talking about the death of civilians. But we're talking about these principles being used there. So if we have a legitimate strategic or even lower level operational military target, and a strategic target can be the steel mills outside of Mariupol, I suppose. That can be a legitimate target. But but if you have other targets, famously churches, medical facilities, and schools, as we've seen, then you have gone to indiscriminate force. You've gone outside of military necessity and distinction. So if you have to bomb a factory, and I'm not saying in this case that I'm giving a pass to the Russian bombing of the different steel mills or nuclear plants, because all sorts of issues arise there. But if there are workers there and that is a legitimate military target, then those individuals would be considered collateral damage. If you are focused upon the civilians, or if you are indiscriminate in your fire, then of course this rule doesn't apply.
So to wrap up our discussion up to this point, countries can break the law, international law, if they use military force in a way that violates the laws of war. But individuals can also be prosecuted for committing war crimes or other crimes against humanity. And there have been allegations that Russian military units have committed war crimes in different parts of Ukraine. We saw recently some of the atrocities that have taken place in the environs around Kyiv, in Bucha, and other places. And international law has attempted to create a machinery for bringing to justice perpetrators of war crimes. In the last several decades, an international criminal court has been created by treaty among a broad number of countries around the world. And under that treaty, the court has jurisdiction to prosecute different types of international crimes, including war crimes. These are crimes that take place during armed conflict. Examples include attacking civilians, directly targeting civilians or civilian objects, attacking people who are involved in providing humanitarian assistance to affected populations, executing civilians or prisoners of war, torture, sexual violence, seizing or destroying property. And that treaty also authorizes the court to prosecute other crimes against humanity and acts of genocide. And we've seen over the last month plus allegations of that type of conduct. I don't know, General McDaniel, if you wanted to comment on any of that as we wrap up our discussion here.
Well, I wonder if we should save it for a different distinction, because I do think we should talk about genocide in one of our later segments. I think that's an important area to clarify for folks, since it's been thrown around in the media so much lately.
Okay, well, we'll leave that discussion to maybe a further video blog posting.